Thank you for joining us this morning. Our customers, thank you for creating time to be with us this morning. We appreciate you. My name is Onesimus Masui. I'm the Premier Center Manager for Flagship Center. And we would like to welcome you this morning to this session, whereby we shall be discussing about the Wealth Report in 2022, both from a Kenyan and African perspective. We hope that you're going to find the session quite useful and insightful. And I think at this juncture, I'll want to pass it over to our MC for the day, Hannah, who will be able to introduce the rest of the panelists and take it away from there. Again, welcome and thank you very much for logging in.
Thank you, Onesimus, and thank you to our Absa Premier clients for joining in. Thank you for our Absa colleagues joining in, and also our Knight Frank representatives. Thank you for your time. We really do appreciate it this morning. So we'll be having a discussion on the Wealth Report 2022 that has just been launched by Knight Frank, and we'll be looking at it from a Kenyan and an African perspective. To help us go through this, we will have John Kihara, the Chief Investment Officer for Absa Asset Management Limited. He has over 15 years experience managing portfolios and giving various clients investment solutions. And we also have Andrew Shirley, who's a senior researcher, Knight Frank Global UK. He is the editor of the prestigious Wealth Report. And the Wealth Report covers the key issues that our ultra-high net worth clients are looking at when they're about to make their investment decisions. He also is the creator of the Knight Frank Luxury Investment Index, and he will be taking us through a deep dive of the Wealth Report 2022. Over to you, Andrew.
Good morning, Hannah. It's fantastic to be with you all. I wish I was in Africa today, but sadly I'm in the UK where it's almost zero, so missing the sunshine of Africa. Now, it's fantastic to have the opportunity to share the findings of this year's Wealth Report with you, and I hope you find the findings insightful and useful. Basically, we create the Wealth Report to highlight some of the opportunities, some of the challenges that our high net worth clients are facing around the world, and how they can use those challenges and opportunities to make better investment decisions, particularly into real estate markets. Next slide, please. Now, the Wealth Report tells a story, and what I'm going to do this morning is go through that story with you. First of all, talking about some of the big wealth trends, the threats and the opportunities that we're seeing around the world. Then we'll look at some of the investment opportunities that we're seeing. And also, obviously, your homes are a huge part of your life. We'll look at some of the performance of prime residential property around the world. And then at the end of the presentation, we'll have a little bit of fun. As Hannah mentioned, I also compile our luxury investment index. We'll look at the performance of some of these investments of passion that I know many of our clients love to collect. Next slide, please. Now, first of all, it's worth pointing out that a key part of the Wealth Report are the results of our attitude survey. Now, this is when we go to private banks and wealth advisors around the world and ask some questions about their clients, the threats their clients are facing, the opportunities, what they're investing in, how they're living, what are their aspirations. And I'd like to say a big thank you to Absa Bank for answering a lot of the questions from a Kenyan perspective. And that means we've got some really great data on the attitudes of Kenyan high net worth individuals that I'm going to be able to share with you today. It's also worth pointing out that all of the research in the Wealth Report, including the attitude survey, was created and conducted before Russia invaded the Ukraine. So we have to bear that in mind when we're looking at some of the findings. But obviously, in the Q&A session at the end, which I'd encourage you to join into, we can look at perhaps what the implications of the war are on some of the sort of themes that we've discussed in the Wealth Report. So next slide, please. So first of all, we're going to look at some of the wealth trends, the big global wealth trends, and also those trends from a Kenyan perspective. What's affecting ultra high net worth around the world. And first of all, I'd just like to look at how wealth has performed around the world. And despite the pandemic, if you were lucky enough to own any kinds of assets, your wealth probably increased last year. And here we can see the change in the number of ultra high net worth individuals. That's those people who have more than 30 million US dollars or more, including their primary residents. So this chart on the screen here shows the numbers of those ultra high net worth individuals around the world. And what we can see is the general theme is that the number of those ultra high net worth individuals increased, particularly in North America and Europe, and that was partly because of the huge amount of money, the stimulus that was being pumped into global economies during the pandemic. But what we can actually see here is that sadly Africa was the only region where we saw a very slight drop in the number of those ultra high net worth individuals. Globally, the number increased by almost 10%. In Africa, it fell by almost 1%. But I don't think we should panic too much about that. I mean, Africa was hit particularly hard by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of tourism, a huge part of most African countries' GDP, and also inward investment during the pandemic. So it's a very slight drop, and it's one that I think, as we'll see from our slides coming up, Africa will recover quite quickly from. But what happens specifically in Kenya, our unique wealth sizing model can tell us. So if we look at the next slide, please. But just before that, let's just look at the future growth prospects, because our wealth sizing model allows us to do that. And over the next 5 years, we're actually seeing strong growth, almost 30% increase in the number of ultra high net worth individuals around the world. As I said, these figures were compiled before the Russian-Ukraine war, so that might have a slight impact on wealth creation in some parts of the world. But globally, I think we are still confident that wealth will increase over the next 5 years. So if we go to the next slide, please. What we can see from here is the Kenyan perspective. So actually, although I said number of ultra high net worth individuals decreased slightly in Africa, what we saw in Kenya was that the number of high net worth individuals, that's those people with net assets of US $1 million or more, slightly increased. And I think that comes down to what Absa likes to call Africa tenacity. There's lots of opportunities for creating wealth in Kenya, and Kenyans are very entrepreneurial. So even during the pandemic, we've seen the number of millionaires rise slightly. And what are we seeing over the next 5 years? Well, we're seeing strong growth in the number of ultra high net worth individuals, 14%, but even stronger growth in the number of high net worth individuals. And that's, I think, because it's actually easier to make $1 million than it is to make $30 million. And excitingly, also over the next 5 years, we are predicting that there will be 2 Kenyan billionaires created. Now, what's also really exciting from a Kenyan perspective, I think, is that as part of our attitude survey this year, we asked the respondents how many of their clients, that high net worth clients, were under 40 and self-made. And as you can see from around the world, the global average was 22%. But if we look at Kenya, that percentage is actually significantly higher at 27%. So Kenyan wealth is younger and it's more entrepreneurial, which I think is a really strong message for the future, particularly when we look at where some of the investment opportunities are going to be in Kenya. Now, we don't just track the number of high net worth individuals as a measure of wealth around the world. We also ask, as part of our attitude survey, how the respondents thought their clients' wealth had changed throughout the year. And it was quite interesting in Kenya, the results actually tied into that sort of slight drop in the number of ultra high net worth individuals. Only 25% of Kenyan respondents said that they thought their clients' wealth had increased significantly in 2021. And that compares with a figure of 54% globally. So our Kenyan respondents were slightly less optimistic about their clients' wealth creation last year. But if we look forward to what's going to be happening this year, our Kenyan respondents were actually much more optimistic. 56% of them said that they thought their clients' wealth would be increasing, compared with only a third globally. So that just shows that people are optimistic that the Kenyan economy, those Kenyan entrepreneurs, are going to be creating lots more wealth as we come out of the impact of the global pandemic. Next slide, please. So as I said earlier, the Wealth Report looks at the threats and the opportunities to wealth creation, and the slide at the moment shows the top 5 global threats identified by our respondents. Inflation right at the top there, and the situation in the Ukraine is probably only going to exacerbate that. But we can also look more granularly at what's happening in Kenya. So next slide, please. So it's really interesting, actually, when we look at Kenya. One of the biggest threats identified by our respondents to the attitude survey was climate change, whereas that didn't feature very highly on a global basis. In Kenya, it's the top challenge, and obviously that reflects the impact of climate volatility in Africa and Kenya. More specifically, a hot summer in the UK can be an inconvenience, but obviously a drought in Kenya can actually be a life or death situation for many people. And obviously also new COVID variants still a significant threat in Kenya because of the impact on the economy of the pandemic in general. Interestingly, domestic government policy, which obviously with an election coming up is going to be a key concern, is down there at number 5. So next slide, please. But what about wealth opportunities? Perhaps this is more interesting and more exciting to look at the challenges. And globally, technological and digital adoption is considered the biggest opportunity. And what's really interesting, if we look at results from Kenya, next slide, please, we can actually see it's exactly the same. Technological and digital adoption has been identified as the top opportunity for Kenyan high net worth individuals. And as I said earlier, a very large proportion of Kenyan high net worth individuals are young, entrepreneurially minded. So I think it's a really great opportunity for the country as a whole that this technology is considered one of the key opportunities. Just as an example, I think I read when I was in Kenya a couple of weeks ago that there's going to be a number of really big data centers, African hubs locating to Kenya, so we can see how technology is affecting real estate opportunities already. Next slide, please. And what's really interesting is that wealth is becoming increasingly global, and as part of the attitude survey, we ask our respondents what proportion of their clients are planning to move countries or get a new passport. And globally, 15% of the high net worth population is considered to be looking to do that. It's actually slightly higher in Kenya, but when we dug down and asked why people thought their clients were planning to move or get a new passport, it was really for investment opportunities, looking to broaden out their portfolios. There was no specific issue about living in Kenya that they wanted to get away from. It was really to broaden their portfolios and look for greater investment opportunities. But when we look from a wider African perspective, if we go up to West Africa, actually 44% of Nigerian high net worth individuals are looking to get a new passport or move countries. So actually we can see that Kenya is in a much stronger position than other African countries, which I think is encouraging. Next slide, please. Now, one of the other things that we like to track in the Wealth Report is how our clients get around the world, how they travel. And pre the COVID-19 pandemic, flying in a private jet was beginning to be considered not a great thing to do because of its impact on the environment. Wealthy people were getting sort of named and shamed for jumping in private jets to fly around the world. One big impact of the pandemic has been this resurgence, this return to using private jets, because obviously scheduled flights were cancelled, and who wants to get on an aeroplane with hundreds of other people when there's a pandemic around? So what we saw last year was this 9% increase in globally in the number of private jet journeys, but in Kenya that actually increased 199%. And the next slide shows where those Kenyan private jet journeys were going. Hopefully you can see on the screen. Obviously a lot of those journeys were internal within Kenya, quite a lot to other countries in East Africa, but we can actually see there's some quite long journeys being undertaken from Kenya to the United Arab Emirates, to Egypt, down to South Africa. So just reflecting, I think, the global nature of Kenyan wealth and Kenyan business as it sort of takes place around the African continent. So that's some of the key wealth trends from Kenyan and African perspective that the wealth report covers. So now let's look at investment, where people are putting their money. So next slide, please. So as I said earlier, 2021 was a bumper year for assets, and real estate investment was no exception. So last year, from a private wealth perspective, we saw more money than ever going into real estate, almost $500 million US. So that was an increase of 52% in terms of private capital going into real estate. And that was a far bigger increase than the amount of institutional money, the amount of sort of funds going into real estate investment. So private wealth, private capital becoming a real driver for international real estate markets. Next slide, please. And actually, what our attitude survey shows us is that Kenyan high net worth individuals really, really love real estate as an investment. Globally, it accounts for 27% of high net worth investment portfolios, but in Kenya, it's almost 50%. I think that's, property is tangible. Everybody loves to own a little bit of real estate, whether that's a plot of land or some kind of investment opportunity. So what are the top 5 current real estate allocations in Kenya? Well, at the moment, it's development land. With land prices rising, people have been wanting to buy land for its investment opportunity, to see its capital values rising, also hotels there, retail, retirement. But what's really interesting, as the next slide shows, is which sectors are becoming of more interest. So what's really interesting is actually we're seeing this shift away from perhaps capital growth from development land to more income generating opportunities like healthcare and retirement. Also, we've got retail and agriculture there. So the sort of Kenyan real estate investment opportunities that high net worths are looking at are slightly changing. Now, where are Kenyan investors putting their money into real estate? Well, globally, real estate is quite an international asset. According to our attitude survey, almost a third of high net worth individuals invest in property overseas, but actually it's a lower proportion, 20%, 19% in Kenya, probably because there's so many opportunities on your own doorstep. But I think that's going to change. As we discussed earlier, Kenyans are becoming more international in their outlook. So we'll be seeing more overseas investment from Kenya, I believe. Obviously, we don't just invest in real estate. And as we mentioned earlier, technological adoption is one of the big opportunities being seen for high net worth individuals. And we like to track that with our attitude survey. So globally, it turns out that almost 20% of high net worth individuals are investing in some kind of crypto asset, whether that's cryptocurrency or some kind of blockchain investment. In Kenya, only 13% of high net worths are investing in that kind of asset, but it's still quite a lot, and it's much more than we've seen in previous editions of the Wealth Report. So while it's not a major theme for Kenyan high net worth individuals, it's certainly not niche. And again, I think as some of those younger entrepreneurs start to flex their muscles, we're going to see more Kenyan investment into some of these digital opportunities. Next slide, please. Now, there's still a lot of cynicism about crypto opportunities. Almost 50% of our respondents globally said high net worth individuals weren't investing because they didn't really believe in crypto as an investment. And actually, that was higher, almost 70% in Kenya. A little bit more cynicism here about some of those investment opportunities. But again, I think that will change in the future as people start to understand some of these opportunities a little bit more and they become more transparent. Next slide, please. Right, so that was a little bit about investment, and the key part of the Wealth Report is tracking the value of where people live, their homes, and we do that with our Prime International Residential Index that tracks the value of properties in 100 of the world's key residential markets. And just coming back to this theme that I've discussed a couple of times, if you were lucky enough to own tangible assets last year, you saw their value increase sharply. So overall, on average, 100 locations in our prime international residential index, they grew by 8.4%. What's really interesting is actually last time we had a global economic crisis back in 2008, 2009, as this slide shows, we could see values, the average value of prime international residential property dropped slightly, but despite the economic influence of the pandemic, last year we saw exactly the opposite. We saw this sharp rise in values. And again, that was down to the amount of money floating around in the system from government support systems. People were looking for tangible assets. People were stuck at home. They didn't get the opportunity to move abroad so much. So a lot of them moved house while they had the opportunity. Next slide, please. And just to see where the strongest growth was, and just to illustrate how much prices did increase, these are the top 5 locations in our prime international residential index. You can see the staggering growth in Dubai, over 40%. Also strong growth in Moscow. I imagine that's going to be tampered down a little bit this year based on all of the sanctions on some of the wealthy Russians, but again, very strong growth in America, San Diego, Miami, growth of over 20%. So this just highlights how much wealth was being created last year and where it was being spent. What about in Nairobi? And actually over the past few years, prime residential values in Nairobi, because of an oversupply, a little bit of uncertainty in the market, have been falling, but actually last year they started to pick up growth of almost 2.5% in the prime Nairobi residential market. People feeling that they're starting to make plans after the COVID pandemic, and also some changes in the digitalization of your land registry has actually made the markets a little bit more fluid. But what we also look at in the wealth report is not just the increase in values, but how much your money buys you around the world. So each year we calculate how many square meters of prime residential real estate 1 million US dollars will buy. And if you go to Monaco, your $1 million is only going to buy you a downstairs broom cupboard, just 14 square meters. But if we're in Nairobi, we're getting over 700 square meters of prime residential property with our $1 million. That just shows you how much further your money can go in different parts of the world. I personally would much rather spend $1 million US on a lovely house in Nairobi than a tiny, tiny, tiny little flat in Monaco. But interestingly, if you're interested in Dubai as an opportunity, you can actually see, despite those strong prices in Dubai, your $1 million still buys you an awful lot of real estate there, over 135 square meters. So actually a good value proposition if you're looking for somewhere outside of Kenya to invest in. Next slide, please. Right, so you'll be pleased to know you're not going to have to listen to me speaking for too much longer. This is the final section of my presentation. At the beginning of the presentation, I said we were going to have a little bit of fun looking at some of the investments of passion that our clients love to collect. And as Hannah said, I'm also the editor of our Luxury Investment Index. This is an index we created about 10 or so years ago that tracks the performance of what we call these investments of passion, the things that wealthy people love to collect. And these go hand in hand with their houses. If you've got a lovely house, you need art to hang on the wall. You probably like a wine cellar or some great cars in the garage. And we tracked 10 of these different asset classes. And last year, which were the strongest performers? Well, actually, it was wine and watches. Last year, both of those increased by 16% on average. But as I said earlier, anyone who had assets has seen their value increase. What we can see across the spectrum of our luxury investment index is most of those asset classes performed pretty well. And on average, when we took the total performance for our Knight Frank Luxury Investment Index, values increased by 9%, which was one of the strongest performances in the index since we created it. So that was what happened last year, but we can also look back over a 10-year period. Next slide, please. And we can see which of the asset classes performed most strongly over 10 years. And if you like a tipple of whiskey of an evening and you've got some rare bottles, well, actually over the past 10 years, they increased in value by over 400%. And also classic cars, our second strongest performer over the past 10 years. So if you're interested in collecting these luxury investments, you don't just need to look at the 12-month performance, you probably want to look at what's been happening over the past 10 years. But if anyone asks me, what should I invest in? My advice is always invest in things that you love, things that you enjoy owning. Don't just invest in it because you think the value is going to go up. That's a bonus. And here, well, what are the wealthy spending their money on in terms of these luxury investments, these investments of passion? Well, these are just a few of the top selling items at auction last year. Some of the traditional asset classes. So we can see a fantastic McLaren F1 there, sold for almost $20 million. There's a Picasso, which was the most expensive work of art to sell last year. I think if you translate that into Kenyan shillings, it's almost 11 billion shillings, which sounds an awful lot of money. And then they're going to watch $5.2 million, a diamond, almost $30 million. When people collect these things, they are really passionate about them. They are prepared to spend an awful lot of money on them. But those were some of the traditional asset classes. The next slide just shows some of the less conventional things that people are prepared to invest in because they love collecting them. Over the past few years, we've seen a huge rise in the value of sneakers, of trainers, particularly those worn by famous sports personalities. These ones here that sold for over $1.5 million were owned by the American basketball player Michael Jordan. People, particularly if it's a game that he played very well in, are prepared to spend a huge amount of money collecting his basketball shoes. I think that again reflects this change in wealth. Younger or entrepreneurial wealthy people are actually collecting different things compared with their parents. Again, a few other things, £500,000, that thing on the left is a meteorite. So just showing the diversity of things that people like to collect. And I could have added any number of different asset classes to this. People paying over $2 million for a Batman comic, over $1 million for a collectible Pokemon card. So the range of investments of passion is growing wider all of the time. But what was the biggest trend in investments of passion last year? Well, it has to be the rise of the NFT, the non-fungible token. These works of art that aren't physical works of art, but are digital works of art held on a blockchain. And this is a work of art that triggered the whole thing. It's called The First 5,000 Days by an artist called Beeple, and last April this sold for almost $70 million, this digital work of art. And since then, the market for these NFTs has been on fire. Next slide, please. So as we can see, last year, around $25 billion of these NFTs, these crypto art, these things you can't even hang on the wall, were sold. So it's amazing how quickly this sort of NFT trend has taken off, perhaps down to the pandemic. A lot of people sitting at their computers, investing digitally, and now buying digital art. As part of our attitude survey, we did ask how many Kenyan high net worth individuals had invested in a non-fungible token. Actually 6%, so not a huge number, but still quite a significant number. Now, I thought it'd be interesting just to look at some of these Kenyan NFT opportunities, and they don't have to be just works of art. For example, your amazing, heroic marathon record breaker, Eliud Kipchoge, he created some NFTs based on little video clips of him setting his amazing records. I think this is him breaking the 2-hour mark in Vienna for the marathon, and he sold a little video clip of this with a personal message from himself for $4 million Kenyan dollars. So these NFTs being used in really interesting ways. Another example on this slide coming up. There's a Kenyan photographer who's decided to try and take pictures of all of the Kenyan wildlife just to preserve it for posterity, and he sells some of those photographs as NFTs, not for as much as Mr. Kipchoge, but people are paying 20,000 Kenyan shillings for an NFT picture of a snake. So it just shows how Kenyans are rising to this NFT opportunity. Now, one of the questions I'm often asked is, why on earth would anyone want to buy a work of art that isn't tangible, that it's not physical, it's only held electronically? And it took me a really long time to get my head around it. I'm almost 50 years old. Some of these things seem very strange to me. But what I tell people, having thought about it, is you really mustn't be too narrow-minded about this. And I like to use an example of my son, George, who I'm going to show you a picture of, just as a really simple example of why these digital assets matter to people. So next slide, please. So, of course, this isn't George. This is a picture of Spider-Man. I'm sure you all recognize him. But actually, George, who's 9 years old, has spent some of his pocket money on what they call a skin. So when he plays games like Fortnite, where you go around shooting baddies, George looks like Spider-Man. I think he's probably paid $10 to look like Spider-Man. Why does he do it? It doesn't make him shoot baddies any better. But when all of his mates are playing this game, they can see that George looks like Spider-Man. So he looks really cool. And it's a really simple example, but I think the same applies to these NFTs. People, especially our younger high net worth entrepreneurs that we discussed earlier, are spending much more of their time digitally. They're online, they're in their metaverses, and their digital personas actually matter to people. People are spending more money now on digital Hermes handbags than they are on the real ones, because this digital world, this metaverse, is where they want to influence people. It's where it matters to be seen, to be cool. So that's why people are actually buying NFT art. It doesn't matter that you can't hang it in your living room, but all of these people's friends, the people they want to influence, their peers, are living in these digital worlds. And in these digital worlds, they can see that people have got these very cool collections of NFT art. So that's why I think we have to be open-minded, not automatically dispel the reasons why people collect these digital assets. But on the other side of the equation, we still have to be cognizant that investment rules still apply. My other slightly older son, who's desperate to make millions of dollars collecting NFTs, he spent $20 on a limited edition comic that was released by Marvel as an NFT. And he said, "Dad, why hasn't my NFT gone up in value?" And I said, "Well, how many of them are there?" And he said, "Well, there was 20,000. It was a limited edition." And I say, "No, 20,000 is not a limited edition. If you're expecting to invest in something where there's 20,000 copies, you are not going to see the value increase, because it just doesn't make sense. So if you are going to collect NFTs or would like to invest in them, you still have to be aware of the normal rules. Don't buy something that's an investment of 20,000. Limited editions, rarity value still count. So I think my final conclusion to my presentation would be the big change that's coming for all of us is this digital opportunity, the metaverse. That's where we're going to be seeing a lot more opportunities. I think we really need to get our heads around those opportunities and not necessarily just write them off as things that apply to young people. They're going to apply to real estate. They're going to apply to investments of passion. Virtually everything that we can invest in, we will be able to invest in digitally in the future. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation. I hope you found some of that at least useful and insightful. If you've got any questions about any of it, please use the chat box or the Q&A box to ask your questions. And I'll now hand back to Hannah to take on the rest of the presentation.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for taking us through that. One thing I've learned is definitely buy a digital Hermes bag. We will now go to the next session where John Kihara, the Chief Investment Officer for Absa Asset Management Limited, will take us through the Absa Wealth Kenya proposition. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Hannah. Esteemed premier clients, invited guests, colleagues, once again, a very good morning. And also very much thanks to that very good presentation from Andrew. I think just listening to Andrew's presentation, of course, is very refreshing. I mean, if you think about some of the investment asset classes that he has spoken about, things like wine, things like collectible items, the digital assets, quite refreshing, and just shows just how the investment world is obviously evolving over time. So I'll move to some of the wealth proposition that as Absa we have been working on, and they are live. Of course, as our esteemed clients, you can continue to invest in, especially as you look to diversify, as you look to grow your investment capital, and also as you look to preserve your capital. So it's going to be brief, and I'll talk about two key wealth proposition. Of course, every day, we're working hard to make sure that we have a full range of different investment proposition. But today I'll focus only on two. And the first one is, of course, for clients or customers who are looking to obviously looking for sort of risk-free investments that obviously have a cash flow element to it, where there's regular payment of income, where of course they're also looking to invest in terms of being able to use some of those securities for collateral. Of course, we have government securities, and in fact, and in terms of this particular asset class that we do facilitate for our clients, clients are saved all the hassles of having to obviously go to access these kind of products directly from the market. So we offer competitive products within the government securities, be it on the short term. These are instruments such as T-bills, which mature, of course, within 1 year, and obviously anything that matures all the way to 25 years as issued by the government of Kenya. So feel free to talk to us. We're able to solution for you on this. And again, as I said, the key important things being that this is very suitable, especially for clients who are looking for regular income, clients who are also looking for a conservative investment, clients who are looking for competitive returns, because these government securities, obviously, from the very short ones, they're yielding anything between 7.3% all the way to 14%. And customers are able to get those kind of good returns. And finally, also, for those ones who may have borrowing needs in the future, these government securities, again, can be used as collateral. The second and also very exciting products that also come on stream in the last 1 month is obviously unit trusts. So unit trusts essentially are collective investment vehicles regulated by the Capital Markets Authority. So investors pool resources together and they put those resources into a vehicle. Again, as I say, this is a vehicle that is regulated. And then that vehicle, through the professional management or having the services of an investment manager, who in this case is obviously Absa Asset Management, is able to go into the market and be able to create an investment portfolio that also is able to address common objectives for these investors. So it's a very efficient investment vehicle because it offers a couple of key advantages. One, of course, it offers diversification because for whatever amount you're putting into this unit trust, investors are able to get a diversified portfolio. And I think Andrew, as part of the challenges that he picked from respondents, of course, there were many macro issues that investors spoke about, things like inflation, like interest rates. You know, the way to deal with those kind of challenges in investment is obviously having a diversified investment portfolio, and these unit trusts do that. The second one is, of course, liquidity. So unit trust, by the very nature of how they run, investors are able to come into this type of funds and be able to get liquidity, meaning they're able to come out of those investments without having to be locked in. And in fact, by regulation, we are required to be able to pay back the investors' money within 3 working days. The last two, and very important, is of course issues to do with security or safety of funds. As we mentioned, of course, these are professionally run, meaning that at the back end, you can trust that Absa Group is obviously having a good investment team to be able to deliver in terms of those investment objectives. So in terms of the specific funds that are now live, and of course, as our esteemed customers, you can be able to obviously come into. There are 5 of them. The first one is the money market fund, which we call Absa Shilling Fund. So the Shilling Fund is denominated. It's a Kenya Shillings denominated investment fund, meaning that investors will put in Kenya Shillings investment, and of course the fund then will go and invest in Kenya Shillings denominated assets. So by the very name, it invests in short-term government securities, it invests in bank deposits, investment grade corporate notes, and the whole idea being to be able to give investors sort of like a constant, stable form of return, in form of income, of course, with low volatility. And I think that's why, as you can see there, from a risk profile perspective, that is rated as low. The other money market fund that is also live is a dollar money market fund. Again, very much similar to the Shilling Fund. The only difference being that investors would put in their funds in form of dollars, and of course, the fund will move in to invest in US denominated assets. Again, short-term government securities, dollar-denominated bank deposits, investment-grade term corporate notes, of course with the very aim, just like the Shilling Fund, to be able to deliver stable income. The third fund is the fixed income fund or the bond fund. So this is a fund that allows investors to be able to take advantage of slightly better returns because this fund is able to invest in slightly longer fixed income instruments such as government instruments, such as corporate bonds, and of course a small portion of money market instruments. So the key thing about this fund is that for investors who are looking for a slightly higher return but also willing to invest in slightly longer instruments, this would be a very good investment opportunity. And of course, from a risk profile, by the very nature of some volatility that may come from some of the longer term fixed income securities, that's why it's classified as a medium risk profile. The other fund is an equity fund, the Absa equity fund. So this is a fund that is mainly favored by investors who are looking for capital appreciation over the medium to the long term. So this is a fund that will go and look for assets that are able to bring about that kind of capital growth. And of course, we know that one of the areas that you're able to get that kind of capital growth, by the very nature of even the name of the fund, is obviously through the shares or stocks which are listed in both local and international markets. And of course, the team at Absa spends countless hours trying to make sure that we have the best and most diversified companies into this portfolio. But of course, by the very nature of volatility in terms of the markets, that's why we classify that as a little bit of high from a risk profile. But of course, this is a fund for investors who are looking to invest within the time frame of at least 3 to 5 years, so that you're able to see those kind of market cycles smoothen and be able to make returns. The last fund is a balance fund. So again, the Absa balance fund, by the very name, again, it's also, I would call it more of a cocktail. So what it tries to achieve is to invest across the key asset classes, such as fixed income, a bit of equities, offshore investments, and the whole idea through this diversified investment portfolio across the different asset classes, then an investor is able to get sort of like a balanced kind of return from all those asset classes. And of course, by the very nature of that, it means from a risk profile perspective, it's a medium. So our esteemed clients, this is just a subset of some of the investment solution that as our clients you can be able to obviously use to diversify and also be able to grow your wealth further. I'll stop there and thank you very much and hand it back to Hannah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for taking us through the Absa Wealth offering. And we are delighted some of our clients have already invested in it, and we are encouraging more and more clients to be able to invest in these offerings so that they can be able to diversify their portfolio. We'll now go through a couple of questions that we've received on chat, and I do encourage you as you continue that you carry on asking your questions. We will be able to answer them. So we'll start off with a comment from Daniel Kamau saying he's joining us from Malindi while on vacation. This is how important this topic is. Thank you so much, Daniel Kamau, for joining us from Malindi while in vacation. We appreciate your time, and we indeed believe that this session has been insightful and useful. We also have a question from George Muga, and this will go out to John. He says, great presentation. Could you help on portfolio diversification?
Thank you very much. A very, very good question. And I think probably the background to that question might be, of course, coming from a point of the kind of volatilities that obviously we see from the market. I think if you think about it, in the last 1 month, with what's happening, especially in Eastern Europe, that obviously has had a big impact across the world. If you think about the cost of fuel, of course, its ramification to markets such as equities markets, we have seen them come off. So I think you're spot on to the extent of portfolio diversification. And I think the core message from these two presentations by myself and Andrew was that I think as an investor it's important to diversify. Different asset classes would behave differently depending on different cycles. So for example, in a period where there's a bit of turmoil, then you'd expect that fixed income securities, and these are securities such as bonds such as money market instruments would tend to do quite well in that kind of cycle. Of course, when it's growth phase, for example, what we had towards the end of last year, with all the issues about COVID now coming to the back end, there was a lot of exuberance about that. So of course, again, we also saw a lot of growth within the equities market. So I think the key message here is that, for an investor to remain, sort of like enjoying good returns, diversification is very key. And I think as investment professional, what we try to do is to create a diversified portfolio that would have different weights for each of the asset classes. And the whole idea being that on an overall perspective, then an investor is able to get a better risk-adjusted return. So thank you, and we'll be very happy to be able to assist where we can in terms of being able to create a diversified investment portfolio. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John, for answering. And we have another question coming in with regards to, and this is to Andrew. So there's the overview of climate as one of the key issues that Kenyan clients are looking that can affect their portfolios. So the question to Andrew is, what was the composition of this feedback, and how exactly do you feel from your view as a researcher that climate could be a huge issue or impacting clients' investment portfolios, or just rather their businesses in general? Over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I mean, that's a huge question, isn't it? And it's really interesting that our attitude survey respondents clearly identified it as being a big issue in Kenya. And I think in terms of investments, there's two things that climate change and the way that governments are sort of reacting to that challenge is two ways it's going to drive investment portfolio. So there's a kind of the push, there's the push and the pull. So you'll be wanting to look at potentially parts of the world that are going to be more affected by climate change, and making sure perhaps that you're not so exposed to those. But then you'll be wanting to look at the technologies that are going to be used to adapt to climate change, and looking to invest in those. And actually, as part of the Wealth Report, hopefully you'll get a chance to read it after the presentation. We have an interview with the CEO of something called the Earthshot Prize, which was an initiative set up by Prince William, who, as you all know, is the heir to the throne in the UK, and he wanted to encourage young entrepreneurs to react to the big challenges facing the world at the moment. And climate change and the journey to net zero was one of those, and he's encouraged young entrepreneurs from all over the world to come up with their ideas for combating climate change. And actually, there were lots of really interesting entrants from across Africa. And so I think we need to look at some of these investment opportunities that perhaps being overlooked by funds, quite simple ways to reduce agricultural emissions or reduce emissions from our households, opportunities for private investors there. But I think what's really interesting actually is that what the Ukrainian crisis has shown us is that some asset classes that were being written off, like fossil fuels, no one was investing in those. Now we're trying to reduce our energy dependence on Russia. Some of those asset classes are coming back into popularity. People are now starting to look at reinvesting into oil fields that previously people thought would never be open again. So although climate change is putting a perspective on renewable technologies, and in the Wealth Report we do look at some of those opportunities in Kenya, perhaps around the Rift Valley, based on geothermal heat, actually these black swan events do show us that we can't necessarily write off some of the older, more traditional asset classes that people were saying that no one wanted to invest in. So Hannah, I think there's, it's a really complicated question, and there's huge implications for investors for whatever asset class they're looking at. Particularly real estate people now want more environmentally friendly, less emitting buildings. So if you have an office block that's greener, its value is going to be higher than an office block that doesn't have such good environmental credentials. So it covers every aspect of the investment spectrum.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. The overview on climate and investment. I think that is quite useful to our clients. We also have a client joining in from Pretoria. Thank you for giving us your time and joining us. There's another question, and this I will direct to John. A client asked, do we have euro or dollar denominated investments? And what's the performance like currently?
All right, thank you very much for that question, a good question. So obviously in terms of being able to offer solutions to clients in terms of different currencies and denominations, of course we do have those kind of investments, be it from the bank deposits, which obviously we can be able to have a further conversation on. And of course, even for investors who are looking to have solutions in terms of their offshore markets, again, we are very excited. There is some work that we are doing in the background, and hopefully we'll be able to deliver that in due time. But I think what's important is that, straight to your question, is that currently we can be able to offer some of the fixed income solutions. I think as we mentioned, for example, on the unit trust, we have a dollar-denominated money market fund. This money market fund, invests in dollar-denominated assets. And if you look at the kind of yields that this fund is obviously generating, as at yesterday, we were sitting at a yield of about 3%. So there is capability. There are products that investors can be able to use just to be able to have solutions on their hard currency. But the point also is that there are many others that as a group we are working on just to make sure that we're able to provide a full suite of hard currency investment solution. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, John, for taking us through that. So yes, we have investment opportunities that are available in other currencies other than our base currency, the Kenya shilling. So that's something that you would be able to benefit from. We also have another comment coming in, just thanking Andrew for the presentation, that it was indeed refreshing. Thank you for your appreciation on that. We have another question to Andrew with regards to what is the expected impact on investments that the Russian and Ukraine conflict could have that would significantly maybe deviate from expectations that we have currently. Andrew, if you could take that up.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. You're giving me all the really big questions here, aren't you? I mean, in the wealth report, even before we knew about the Ukrainian crisis, we were talking about inflation as being one of the big threats to or challenges to wealth creation in 2022. And obviously, what we've seen is that the invasion has exacerbated that. It's created higher energy costs, higher food costs. The Ukraine and Russia account for about a third of 25% of the world's grain exports. So we're seeing food prices around the world increase. So we've got this big inflationary picture. So what I think that means in terms of investments is that people will be looking for investments that can ride that sort of inflationary pressure. Real estate, obviously a very good opportunity in certain situations to do that, especially if you've got income generating assets. And it was really interesting that in Kenya we were seeing this shift towards income generating real estate assets such as retirement, housing and that kind of thing. So I think we will see more of a focus on these more tangible assets. I mean, gold has done pretty well since the invasion, and I think some of these digital asset classes and these investments of passion will also do well. So I don't think we're necessarily going to see a change in some of the trends that we were predicting in the wealth report, but I think we will see those exacerbated and perhaps even strengthened. And as I said earlier, we're going to see an increased focus on perhaps new technology, renewable energy, perhaps even nuclear energy, and agriculture in different parts of the world, which could obviously benefit Africa, just to reduce this reliance on exports of food and energy from a fairly geopolitically unstable part part of the world. So those are just some of my sort of key thoughts on how investment trends might change. But I think, as I said, we had identified them in the wealth report before the conflict, but I think the conflict has only exacerbated and strengthened those trends and opportunities that we were looking at. So I hope that partly answers the question, Hannah.
Yes, it does, Andrew, and thank you so much for that feedback. And thank you for our clients as you continue to engage us on our chats. I will also mention that there will be a survey that will come in after this. Kindly don't log off once we are done. Please complete the survey because we would like to create more customer-centric sessions like this. And for us to do so, we need your feedback so that we can add on to it. So another question that comes in, and this question comes to John. The question is ideally about the macroeconomic environment that Kenya finds itself in. We're seeing prices of essential items going up. We're seeing that the disposable incomes are still the same. And the question is, what way forward do we see for the Kenyan economy? Yeah.
Thank you, Hannah, and that's a good question. I think anybody who lives within the boundaries of Kenya obviously identifies with that particular comment. Of course, a lot also has to do with what's happening on the global scale. Of course, the crisis in Europe has had a big impact, as correctly said, about the pump prices locally. Of course, that would have some material implication, especially in terms of some of the prices, for example, of fuel, of some of the especially the grain, which we quite a lot of that comes from Eastern Europe. So essentially, it means then that it's a fairly difficult environment. But I think one of the most important thing about these kind of scenarios, and obviously looking at also the bigger issue about the politics and the elections that's coming in the second half, is that it also comes with big opportunities. I think for investors who are much more bolder, they're also able to get into the market when the prices for commodities or for some of those assets, investment assets, are fairly low, and therefore be able to benefit from a medium to long-term perspective. So, for example, if you look at the local environment, if you look at for example, the stock exchange, we have seen a bit of weakness there, but broadly, if you look at some of the companies listed there, like the telecommunication sector, within the banking sector, they're still very strong sectors, which we think, despite the short-term shocks that we are seeing, they should be able to deliver good returns into the future. Again, also in this kind of environment, it pays also to be quite looking at some of the more sticky, more stable sort of investment destinations. Again, as we spoke about, things like government securities, which obviously means that given the kind of stability, risk-free nature that they have and constant income, it also makes sense to be able to invest in those kind of securities that are not impacted by, of course, what's happening within the wider macroeconomic environment. So I think is to reiterate the point that it's important to remain invested in the markets, different markets, be it property, be it fixed income markets, be it equities market, be it offshore markets. Because I think what we have seen is that over time, remaining in these particular markets, you're able to take advantage of some of the weaknesses in terms of the prices. And I think the point is that also that, as Absa, we remain ready to be able to work with the clients, to be able to provide that diversification that is needed. Because truth be told, investment cycles will always keep changing. And I think as long as you keep rebalancing the portfolio by picking what is important in different market cycles, then over the medium term and long term, you definitely remain as a winner. So I hope, Hannah, I've answered that fairly tough question. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. You have cracked it and answered it in a way that I believe that our client has benefited from. So thank you so much for your response. We have quite a bit of questions. We have another question out to Andrew, and this is specifically on collectibles. Given your vast experience on the Knight Frank Luxury Investment Index, how are collectibles valued and verified?
Yeah, that's a really fascinating question, Hannah. And it's, if you are planning to invest in these categories, you do really need to understand them well, particularly if you're looking at them as investments. I mean, often how they are valued, it's really just how much people are prepared to pay for them. So it will be based on auction results, and we can follow those because they're publicly available. And a lot of the values in our luxury investment index, that's what they're doing. They're tracking auction results, whether it's handbags selling at auction or art selling at auction. So it's not really like real estate or other more traditional investments. There's no precise methodology on how you do go and value these things. It can literally just be what the market is telling you, and public auctions are quite a good way to do it because they're fairly transparent. You know what's happening. Private markets can be a little bit less transparent. A lot of classic cars are sold privately, so it's not so clear what those values are. So you can't. I mean, there are some things like perhaps diamonds, coloured diamonds. There's a very specific grading system for those, so you can take those to an expert and they will tell you that your blue diamond is a fancy, vivid so and so, and that that gives you some idea of its value. Others, it's a lot more opinion based. I mean, works of art, different art experts will have different ideas about what the value is. And you talk about verification, and one thing we have to be careful about is there are a lot of fakes floating around, particularly in the art market, the rare wine market, even the rare whiskey market, and some of the forgers are getting incredibly sophisticated, and it can be really difficult to track which are the fakes and which aren't. So you do need to take investment advice and don't invest in the sector without doing your research first. But each sector varies. It's each asset class will have its own different features, and what you want to look at is provenance, as we saw with those basketball shoes. If something's been worn by a famous sports star, it's going to be worth more value. If it's a classic car, it's been driven by someone famous, like Sterling Moss in a race, it will be more valuable. And look at rarity. The fewer there are of a certain object, the more valuable it's going to be. But I think the one piece of advice is you've just got to do your background advice and go in with your eyes open, and don't just accept that something is valuable or it's a fund that you should invest in just because somebody tells you it's a hot asset class. Not every bottle of whiskey is going to be rising in value compared with our index. These wider asset classes don't. Not everything is super valuable. So you've got to do your research. That would be my main piece of advice. And buy something that even if it doesn't go up in value, you're still going to enjoy owning it.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for that. So invest in your passion and do your research. I think that's what I've got from that response. Again, feel free to post in any questions to Andrew or John in regards to this session, and we'll keep on engaging them on the same. I have a question for John that's coming from one of our clients. Apart from real estate, which other investment class can a client invest in currently to ensure against inflation?
Thank you very much. Again, a good question. So of course, inflation remains the biggest threat to any investment because it means that, as inflation picks up, which we have seen now globally is a big phenomena from, for example, the developed markets now having inflation rates way above 5%, to, for example, markets like ourselves, where we have stubbornly had inflation at above 7%. So inflation is a big thing that obviously as investors we need to consider. So in terms of assets that are able to, in a way, hedge against inflation, so these have to be the growth assets. And these are assets, of course, by the very nature of how they are. They're able to appreciate in price, or they're able to give incomes that obviously is able to be higher than the inflation. And I would say they are broadly from a local context. Of course, if you look at, for example, our fixed income securities, such as government securities, if you think about the current inflation at about 5%, an investment in a government security from the very short ones, like the 91-day Treasury bill, which is sitting at about 7.3, to the longest 25-year Treasury bond, which is sitting at about 14%. In a way, it's able to give a return that's obviously higher than the average of about 7% that you have seen from an inflation perspective. So that's sort of like the most conservative way, given the kind of high returns that we have within the local market. But traditionally, of course, other growth assets have been equities or stocks. And the reason for that is, of course, looking at companies, and especially the ones that are dominant in their various sectors, they're able to pass that cost to the consumers. And we have seen, if you look at the listed segment of the Nairobi Securities Exchange, they're obviously good companies that are able to put up with inflation, for example, in the banking sector, in the telecommunication sector, in the construction sector. So we think that an investor who is able to build a good portfolio of this kind of listed stocks is obviously able to, in the medium to the long term, be able to, on average, be able to beat inflation. And I think, as we mentioned, we have those kind of solutions in-house, for example, through the Absa Equity Fund, which invests in those kind of companies. I think the third is, of course, property. And I think Andrew did a very good job in terms of just showing how both locally and globally how properties have been. So property, of course, have been traditionally a key asset class, especially for most investors, because looking at the kind of rental income, which most of it, especially for the commercial side, it's able to adjust to inflation, and for that reason, you obviously, as an investor, you're able to put up with inflation. And of course, the capital appreciation that comes from holding property assets. So again, that's also a good area of looking at it. I think the other part is, of course, other alternative assets that obviously Andrew walked us through, which over time they seem to have done quite well. Collectible items, those kind of things. I think studies have shown that they're also able to put up with inflation. And of course, finally, if you look at also relating it to the second point about the stock exchange, also a lot of these global markets also are able to give sort of like opportunities by investing in some of these leading companies that are able to generate good returns over the future. So those are some of the 5 key assets that we think as an investor, if you're well diversified, you have the right mix, you should be able to generate returns that are able to beat inflation, and also returns that are also quite competitive. Thank you, and back to you, Hannah.
Thank you, John, so much for the insightful answer to that. And I believe it's both useful and practical for our clients to be able to execute on that. As we come to a close, just one more question to Andrew, and this is in regards to the private jets that the Kenyans clearly are into right now in terms of 199%, if I remember correctly, growth on use of private jets. So wanted to look at the percentages in terms of you had described that 33% was within Kenya and the rest was within the African context. Just a bit of overview on that, please. Question that has come in on that, the private jets.
Yeah, so the data that we're using is tracking where those jets are going. Although it shows that most of the traffic is within Africa or the Middle East, that doesn't mean those journeys aren't longer, but there's just a limit to how far the jets could go. So that there may well be people who are transferring in Dubai onto a different jet, or whatever. But I think it just shows how people are prepared to adapt and use different means of transport when the sort of scheduled aviation isn't available. I think probably the one thing to emphasize is that those jet journeys, the majority of them won't be on an individual's own private jet. Most of the growth that we are seeing in private jet journeys is on chartered jets. So I don't think we should jump to the conclusion that Kenyans are suddenly buying lots of private jets to fly around the world on. These would be chartered journeys. But I think it just really is an interesting sort of snapshot of how mobile Kenyan wealth is around the world. And it's just interesting that the trend seems to have been embraced by Africa more so than other parts of the world. We're not seeing this great increase in Asia. In Asia, for example, that hasn't picked up during the pandemic, perhaps because of their much stricter lockdowns in Hong Kong and so forth. But if anyone's interested in this in more detail, on the Wealth Report website, we do have a link to a widget that allows you to look at every single country in the world and track their private jet traffic. So if anyone's interested in that, please do get in touch, and I can point you in the right direction so you can really dig into these private jet trends.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for taking us through the private jet trends happening in Kenya right now. We'll have our last question, and this will be to John. Do we offer any kind of REIT type of funds?
Thank you, Hannah. I believe REIT is the Real Estate Investment Trust. All right. So obviously, as Absa, we don't have a REIT. And REIT, there are two types of REIT. There is obviously an income real estate investment trust, and of course, there's a development real estate investment trust. But by the very nature of some of the products that investors can invest in, for example, the unit trust that we described, those kind of funds can be able to invest in real estate investment trust, especially the ones that are listed on the Nairobi Securities Exchange. So the REITs that are available in the market, there are 2 or 3 companies that have already listed the REIT. It's one of the investment asset classes or securities that some of the products that we run, especially the equity type of funds, can be able to look at. So as we look at the whole investment universe, we obviously do consider the REIT. But directly, we currently don't have a real estate investment trust run by Absa. Thank you.
Okay. So we want to thank you so much, our clients, colleagues, Knight Frank representatives, for the engagement that you have been taking us through. We appreciate it, and we appreciate your time on this discussion. And now we'll be looking to wrap up, and I will take it up to Onesimus from Premier.
Thank you, Hannah. I think for me it was a very nice session, quite insightful. For me, the key takeouts: don't be narrow-minded, but investment rules should always apply. And of course, the new trends, being a basketball fan, the auctioning of Michael Jordan sneakers, of course, caught my eye. Yeah, quite interesting. So we hope that you all found the session quite insightful. We thank you for your time. I want to thank the speakers, the panel led by Andrew, John, and the MC, Hannah. Thank you very much for wonderful work. We want to promise our customers that we'll be having more of such, and like we keep on saying, this is in regards to the value proposition that we do promise you, and we hope that with such kind of sessions we are creating value. So in case you have any queries in regards to this session or any other query, you can always reach out to your RM for support. And And we'll also like to request you after the end of this session, kindly do the survey. I think it's a very short survey. Should be able to take you less than 3 or 4 minutes. We will greatly appreciate your feedback. Thank you very much for being with us this morning. We do appreciate for your time, and we thank you very much. So God bless. Good day.